Thanks very much to Jason for that really warm welcome to country. It's great to be here on Jojo Wollongong country. As George mentioned, I'm Derek Sandow. I'm the project manager for Marna Banggara. Here to talk about some of the challenges that we've faced. So look, before I get started, I just wanted to introduce myself, a bit of my background and what sort of brings me here today. I've been lucky enough in my career to work in a lot of amazing places in this amazing country. I've worked as a park ranger up in the Territory, worked in some amazing coastal landscapes. The Ningaloo Coast World Heritage Area with seals down on Kangaroo Island. I've worked as a threatened flora ecologist, and I've also undertaken a lot of work in the introduced predator control sphere as well. And the reason why I sort of mention this is it's really driven my passion, I guess, for conservation and rewilding projects like Marna Banggara and these initiatives like the Biolinks Alliance. I really want to be part of a situation where we can actually really contribute to some meaningful change over the coming years, and I don't want to see any species lost on my watch. So, something that really floats my boat, mashes my spuds. Just out with my kids, taking them out bettong monitoring with me, and it's really exciting to see the joy on their face. See these animals that might be lost, in the future if we don't, undertake the works required to. So look, before I get cracking, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are today, but also the lands from which the Marna Banggara project is being undertaken. So the Narungga people of Garunda, just acknowledge their deep and spiritual connection to country that's always been there and always will be, and just really acknowledge the importance of traditional ecological knowledge for projects like Marna Banggara to be successful, but conservation projects across Australia. For those of you lucky enough to have travelled over across to the Yorkes, it's a beautiful place. Ecotourism is a massive industry over there. There's lots of boating, camping, and fishing opportunities. The ecotourism industry probably contributes over $200 million to the local economy every year. It's also a really profitable dryland agricultural region. So it's known as the barley capital of South Australia. Every time you enjoy a Australian ale, look, there might be some of the Yorke Peninsula right there. But like many places in regional Australia, it's experiencing this sort of demographic decline. Young people leaving to look for opportunities elsewhere. Monitoring of native ecosystems over the last couple of decades is really showing that, some of these plants and ecological communities are really at threat and are at risk of actually disappearing altogether. So it's really important for us to acknowledge the fact that healthy ecosystems will play an important role in protecting these economic values going forward. Now, look, I don't have to tell you guys here what a healthy ecosystem is. I'm pretty sure you guys have got a pretty good idea. But for me, it's an environment that is sustainable. So it's an environment that's got the functions, it's got the organisms, it's got the species there that it needs to be sustainable and look after itself in the long term. Unfortunately, on the Yorke Peninsula and across much of Australia, as we all know, a lot of those really important organisms, those animals that are functionally important, are going missing. And that's no different on the Yorke Peninsula. We've lost almost all of our small to medium-sized ground-dwelling mammals that are undertaking these important functions like soil engineering. So these are like your bettongs, your bandicoots. You've got your seed and spore dispersers, your native rodents, and you've got your all-important predators as well that help to regulate the environment. And those are your bigger predators like your quolls, but also your smaller ones like your dunnuts. And unfortunately, on the Yorke Peninsula, these guys have been replaced by introduced species. So we've got rabbits and hares, undertaking the soil engineering functions. We've got black rats, house mice, spreading, dispersing seeds and spores around the environment, and you've got foxes and cats, of course, undertaking the predator roles, and they're not doing a good job in relation to native ecosystems that can't cope with this. So, fortunately, On the Yorks, we've got a really forward-thinking community there. So they recognise the importance of healthy ecosystems to the economy, obviously for conservation purposes, but for the prosperous economy going forward. And through this process of conservation action planning, some really forward-thinking ideas were put forward, and this concept of rewilding, if you like, was born. Rewilding, fascinating term to talk about. I watched with great interest the discussions at the Symposium last year about rewilding. We discuss it as part of our project a lot of the time. Is it appropriate to use? We certainly don't want to downplay the significance and the work that was done by First Nations people for tens and tens of thousands of years managing the country. What we're talking about when we use the word rewilding is restoring lost ecological processes that have been replaced by these processes from these introduced species. So that's what we bring it down to, and we just find that the term resonates with the community. Like Sophie was saying, it's a lot easier to get interest when you use the term rewilding than restoring lost ecological processes. So for a local concept, for the local context, we came up with a plan, I suppose. Really simple. If we can control introduced predators, foxes and feral cats, and manage their impacts, we can then reintroduce some of these functionally important native species that have gone missing in the landscape, since colonisation, and they can start performing those really important ecological functions again. That'll lead to a healthier landscape. You get improved agricultural outcomes, less predation on your fat lambs, less disease and better birthing rates because you don't have toxo in the environment, better meat production, you don't have sarco in your meat for your meat producers, and healthy ecosystems will support this tourism industry and what that brings with it. People are going to stay there. If people are coming and visiting the country, businesses are going to be able to prosper. It's going to keep people there. It's going to be a healthy and prosperous country. So that's easy. Three-step process. Let's get cracking. Obviously, not that simple. I've just got on the screen here the results of a very simple survey that we undertook at the start of the process. Basically, just asking the community, do you support this principle of rewilding? And as you can see on the screen, overwhelming support for the project, but there's certainly a few people in there that don't support it, and a few people that have got some questions. So we're working in an environment on the bottom of the Yorks that's a working landscape. So we're not asking people to stop undertaking agriculture. We don't want to, return the country to its, pre-European state. We just want to be able to demonstrate going forward that a strong, healthy economy can coexist with some conservation outcomes. But some of the things people were interested in, constructing a predator management fence across the bottom of the peninsula, raised some questions. How am I going to get stock around? How am I going to get my machines through? Is it going to funnel native animals, emus and kangaroos, onto roads? Lots and lots of questions. What's going to happen in a bushfire? There's obvious questions that will be raised about the use of poisons. So controlling introduced predators requires the use of poisons. So people have got concerns, about their working dogs, but potentially don't support that. There's also this idea about if we're bringing back some of these native species, what are their impacts going to be? Is it going to impact me? Is it going to affect my agricultural productivity? If you bring koalas back, they're going to eat my chooks. Lots of different scenarios. Who's going to eat all the mice? We're going to end up with mouse plagues. If there's no foxes and cats around to control the mice around my house is going to be overrun with mice. And of course, if we're talking about controlling feral cats, what impacts is that going to have on domestic animals? Domestic cats can be persecuted. So lots of things for us to think about. And what's really important for projects like Marna Banggara, and I think this will interest people here today, is how do we ensure that social licence is there so that we can do the work that we need to make these projects successful. We've learnt the hard way on the Yorke Peninsula how important social licence is. And there was an example, so the Tamar wallaby was reintroduced to the southern Yorke Peninsula back in the early 2000s. It's quite an interesting story. I won't bother you with the details today. But basically the mainland subspecies was thought to be extinct. There were some animals that were taken over by a former governor to New Zealand, and New Zealand were trying to eradicate them because they were a pest on the island, Cow Island, that they'd been reintroduced to. Interestingly enough, brush-tail rock wallabies were also taken over there. But they were reintroduced to southern Yorke Peninsula, and unfortunately the community, First Nations consultation wasn't necessarily best practice at the time, and the reintroduction has been successful ultimately today, but there are some real legacy issues there. So the community wasn't really on side. There was big concern about the fact that Tamar wallabies, which are actually declared as an agricultural pest on Kangaroo Island, which is fox-free, and farmers were worried that it was going to affect their bottom line. So the engagement wasn't great, and we've actually been persecuted through the media, even in the published literature. The reintroduction is used as an example of what not to do. But yeah, I've just got some points up there on the screen. I won't hammer too much on them, but basically, engaging with our stakeholder groups is super important to us, and not just engagement, but we need to bring people along on the ride for this project to be successful. We don't want a situation where we're working on a project that is working, we're working with the community, we're working with First Nations groups, not just running a project that engages with them. And get on the front foot, be positive about what we're doing. Even though we do need to undertake legal control of introduced predators, we all know that that's part of the process. But what we're doing is we are there to protect native species. We're there to bring back these species that might go missing, in our lifetimes if we don't do something about it. We're there to demonstrate that healthy ecosystems can coexist with a strong, productive agricultural and economic environment. And be prepared. So tackle all these proactively and get ahead of the game, basically. So, look, I'll get into the nuts and bolts of what the project's all about. We'll get into our first step. So the first step that we identified was strategic predator control. So our aim is what we're heading for the Goldilocks zone. So anyone here that's been involved with an eradication program, weeds, pest animals, whatever it might be, will probably be pretty familiar with this sort of 90-10 scenario. And so what that is that you use 10% of your resources to get rid of the first 90% of your problem species, and then you have to use 90% of your resources to get rid of the last 10. It's always the hardest. So we understand that on the scale that we're talking about. So this is the Yorke Peninsula. The fence is across the narrow bit there in black and white. We've got 140,000 hectares at the bottom end. So it's a massive scale. There's towns, national parks, there's a lot of agriculture, hundreds and hundreds of landholders, fishing villages, you name it, we've got it. So it's a massive scale. We know that eradication of cats and foxes is not going to be economically feasible. But we aim to control them and then manage them at a level that actually allows us to reintroduce these functionally important and missing native species and then maintain that going forward. It needs to be sustainable for this project to be successful over the long term. So we're working across tenures, we're working with landholders where we can, we're undertaking sort of a variety of control methods, but most importantly, we're monitoring what's going on. Good, bad, ugly, we want to know about it so that we can adaptively manage the project and make those changes that we need to. So here I've just got a little bit more detail about some of the control activities that we undertake. Yeah, again, I won't talk too much about it right here, but we try and basically fill the toolbox, get access to all the tools at our disposal to try and be effective. Aerial baiting, at the end of the day, it's the most cost-effective measure across a broad scale. Can't do that everywhere. Rules and regulations, there's laws to abide by, and quite frankly, it's just impossible. Ground baiting, where we can't aerial bait. Trapping, shooting, felixes, new technologies, they're all fantastic opportunities for us to control foxes and cats. But they are time consuming, they are resource intensive, so they need to be used strategically. And we're looking at new technologies where we can. So there's some fantastic tech coming up, the trap alert systems, for example. If we can identify which traps are closed and which ones are open remotely, you can really reduce your inputs by 60, 70, 80%. The use of artificial intelligence to help us with our monitoring programs. We generate millions of camera images per year as part of our project. So the use of these online AI platforms can help us manage those things. But most importantly, getting that community support for the project, getting that community involvement. They're the people on the ground. They're passionate about this place. They see a future for them in the landscape, and they see a future for native species and economic prosperity. So by getting people involved in the project, it really helps keep the project flowing along. But look, here I'd like to, just talk about brush-tailed bettong. So look, they're the first species that we identify to bring back as an functionally important species. They're a soil engineer. They dig in the soil. They're nature's little gardeners. A bettong can turn over 2 to 6 tonnes of soil per year. They create these little micro habitats where seeds can blow in, water infiltrates. They're spreading mycorrhizal fungi around. They're really important critters, but they are really vulnerable to threats like foxes and cats and habitat loss. So, they 250 years ago, they would have been one of the most common species that you would have seen in southern Australia. Disappeared from most of their range post-colonisation, and they were just surviving in a few isolated pockets on the mainland of southwest WA and also on some islands as well. But largely due to a really successful fox control program as part of the Western Shield project in WA, they recovered really well in these pockets in WA, so well in fact that they were actually removed from the threatened species list, the first species to be removed from that list in WA in 1996. Everything was going great, everyone was patting themselves on the back, and then just a few years later the decline in their numbers began. And over a period of about 6 to 7 years, 90% drop in numbers, and they were back right up to the top of that critically endangered list. So this is just a reason why I sort of bring up this story is it's just really highlights the importance of monitoring programs and understanding what's happening in your environment, good, bad, and the ugly, so that you can take measures to, reverse or strengthen what you're doing. So part of that, probably that decline in the early 2000s, might have been a couple of things, might have been disease, potentially from feral cats, but it was certainly a switch from fox predation to feral cat predation of these animals. So our counterparts in WA, they're really at the forefront of feral cat control in South Australia, so they developed some control methods. The Eradicat bait was really important, and the recovery of this species is now back on track again. But it's just a really interesting story of the importance of monitoring and having that long-term planning and resources to be able to respond.
Past is our future. A story on the troubles all the way through. Now you bring them back on rank.
So yeah, there's just a little video from our pilot release of brush-tailed betons, also known as the woylie in WA to the Noongar people, and Yorke, or Yorke in plural, to the Marna people of South Australia, back in 2021. So yeah, Wedge Island, great place, really interesting to see. It's one of those spots where back in the 80s when you could do these sort of conservation work without being monitored by threatened species committees and all that type of thing, where they just went around to islands where there was no foxes and cats and just dropped off a heap of species and just to see how they go. So Wedge Island, you know, you've got brush-tailed betons, you've got the black-flanked rock wallaby, Pearson's rock wallaby over there, you've got southern hairy-nosed wombats. And what's really interesting is there are these rock wallabies everywhere, and there is some great rock wallaby habitat around the coast, but what you'll actually find is the rock wallabies are actually using the southern hairy-nosed wombat burrows for refuges. So you'll find them in the middle of the island, and you'll find you'll find rock wallabies, wombats, betons, you know, penguins, all sorts of animals using these. So yeah, I digress. Wedge Island, beautiful spot. But yeah, we undertook the pilot release of 40 animals from Wedge in August 2021. And so that was a bit of a pilot release just to see how things were going to go. So we followed that up in 2022 with some animals from WA, from the Perak region of WA on the map there. So beautiful spot if you ever get a chance to go over there. Amazing, you know, bandicoots, phascogales, numbats, yeah, awesome. And then again last year we followed up with another 73 animals from the Dryandra area of WA. Now it's really important for us, even though we've got access to thousands of animals probably on nearby Wedge Island, which is in the Spencer Gulf, it's really important for us to bring these animals over from WA. They represent the most significant sort of genetic component of the species here in Australia. And they're also persisting in WA with low numbers of foxes and cats in the environment. So despite all the great work that Parks and Wildlife do over there controlling foxes and cats, they do persist with low numbers. And so behaviourally as well, it's important for us to bring some of those animals over. And interestingly, they're quite a bit bigger than the wedgies. The wedgies with no foxes and no cats, they're actually one of those sort of island traits. You tend to get animals that get bigger or get smaller, and so the brush-tailed bettong has got smaller. Now there's a huge number of challenges involved with translocations, and we've got a team of experts. We've got a translocation team made up of species experts and reintroduction ecologists to really guide things going forward for us. So we're trying to do things, best practice. The biggest threat for us, or biggest challenge if you like, is because we know that we're always going to have low numbers of foxes and cats in our project area. That's the biggest challenge for us, is to demonstrate that we can get fox and cat numbers to a low enough number that their impacts on these really vulnerable threatened native species is negligible. Lots of other things that we considered. I won't go into too much detail here, but we've got lots of things going for us on the southern Yorke Peninsula. We've got a really big project area, 140,000 plus hectares. We've got access, the WA government has been really supportive of us and this project, allowing us to translocate animals from WA. And we aimed for 200 animals to, form that founding population, which is fantastic to have access to that many animals. We got to 193, so we got pretty close. So we're pretty happy with that. But yeah, certainly foxes and cats are our biggest concern at this point in time. And so as part of that process of getting our approvals and getting that social licence and getting support for the project to do our pilot release, we had to demonstrate that our monitoring programs, first of all, were robust enough that we could detect foxes and cats in the environment. But then we also needed to demonstrate that our resources in terms of being able to manage these introduced predators was sufficient enough to be able to respond if needed. So this slide here is just an example of some information we put together to demonstrate that we could track specific animals. It's a bit easier with cats than it is with foxes, because they generally, if you get some good quality images, you can identify individuals through their coat patterns, and sort of just demonstrating that we had the resources to be able to respond in the event that we're having some catastrophic losses of animals post introduction. But the most important question, and the question we get asked all the time, how is it going? We're sort of 3 years in now, if you like, since our first reintroduction. Just up on the screen there, I've got a map from last year's monitoring. I've got some more up-to-date maps there, but that's all I had access to at the time. But the most important thing up there on the screen is that graph up there on the right. So they're the results of our bettong trapping over 9 trapping periods that we've undertaken since that first reintroduction. So the trapping effort's not equal, so don't worry too much about the height of those columns, but what's significant in this graph is that the different colours represent the different cohorts of animals that were reintroduced. So you've got in blue, you've got the wedgies. The dark blue is the 2021 cohort. The light blue is the 2022 cohort. So we had some animals in 2022 from Perup in WA and a few to top up from Wedge Island. The orange is the WA animals from Perup, and we've got 2 different shades there. That distinguishes between animals that we translocated from the Perup sanctuary. They've got a large fenced sanctuary, I should say, there, from which they've got no foxes and cats. But we also have got animals that we trapped out in the wild as well. And similarly, in green, we've got animals from Dryandra area of WA. And again, they've got a sanctuary there, so we have sanctuary animals and wild animals. But perhaps most importantly is in yellow, we've got Southern Yorke Peninsula born animals. So those are animals that have been born and bred. And what that sort of demonstrates, and what's the really positive thing about what we've seen through our trapping efforts so far, is that we're getting all of those cohorts being represented. Even in sort of, December 2023, you've got these wedged islands, which are animals from Wedge Island, I should say, which they're predator naive. They don't know what a fox and cat is. You go to Wedge Island, and they'll almost hop up to you. And they're also not necessarily the most genetically robust. There's a few stories floating around, but I don't think they were. I don't think there was too many founding animals in that population. But we're still trapping them. A couple of years after we first released them, and we do have low numbers of foxes and cats in the environment, so that's pretty positive. And again, with the other cohorts of animals, the sanctuary animals from WA and the wild animals, we're getting all of those cohorts being represented, but most importantly, we're getting lots and lots of new animals into the environment. So we've got a PhD student that's working on doing some population estimates for us, so I don't actually have population estimates to give you, but what we do have is we've got evidence against our criteria for success that things are going well. Through our trapping, we're seeing that the animals are really healthy. Body weight, body condition, all really positive indicators there. We've got good survivorship post-release. So we've monitored these animals with tracking collars and also tail transmitters to monitor survivorship post-release. So survivorship's been really good. We've also got evidence of breeding, and we've also got recruitment into the population, which is demonstrated by those yellow animals. And they're also dispersing around the landscape as well. So what's really positive is that there's a massive amount of area for these guys to move into as the population grows going forward. So yeah, really quite exciting. On the screen here, I've just a bit of a deeper dive, if you like, into what specifically was going on with sort of fox and cat activity before, during, and sort of after our Benong translocations were occurring. Now, in the middle there, we've got some higher figures. That was a period where we needed our monitoring cameras for another project, so we actually reduced our camera array and we left the cameras in situ, the ones that were detecting high numbers of foxes and cats. So we probably artificially inflated there, but that's a bit of a caveat. But we set ourselves a target, if you like, of 3% relative activity of foxes and cats. So by that, that's just the, percentage detection per camera night of cats and foxes. And 3% was just a number that we came up by sort of going through the literature, look what was happening in WA and sort of in southern Australia. We're a mesic environment, we've got really good habitat quality, dense understory, habitat complexity, so good refuge areas for these species. So we identified 3% as a good target figure. And prior to that first Benong release, we were a little bit high, but we're able to bring that down to within our targets. What you can see here is, so we've got cats in blue and foxes in orange. And so what we know about foxes is, their activity can peak on a seasonal basis, which is in line with their breeding. You'll see increases in activity in summer and early autumn as young foxes sort of disperse around the landscape. So we've seen that on the Yorke Peninsula. Cats tend to be more responsive to environmental conditions and prey availability, so their numbers can sort of fluctuate, at odds seasonally to foxes. But what I've also overlaid on top here is just what kind of control activities we've undertaken in order to try and manage this sort of these activity levels. So we're using that 3% almost as a trigger value, if you like. So prior to that first release, everyone was a bit nervous. We had some foxes and cats around. We weren't too sure how it was going to go. So we undertook aerial cat baiting, identified as AC, in May 2021. Early winter is the best time to bait for feral cats. It's when there's you minimise your risks to non-target species, but it's also that time of the year when cats are most likely to be searching. There's low prey availability generally in the environment, so it's that time of year that cats are going to be more likely to be attracted to and consume baits. T represents sort of targeted trapping efforts that we undertook in the area, and AF is aerial fox baiting. So undertaking those sort of control measures prior to the first release, we were able to get to our target levels, and we did see a slight spike in cat numbers, immediately post-release, but we were, again, with some targeted trapping, we sort of managed to sort of keep that in track. But, we were really able to knock those fox numbers down. We got those numbers down close to zero for a significant period of time. As I mentioned, through this period here where we reduced our camera array to 10 cameras from 30. The figures are probably artificially inflated, but again, they did really peak, and we were getting a little bit worried they were getting a bit high, so we undertook some targeted trapping over summer. Again, prior to the first release of animals from WA and the top-up animals from Wedge Island, we undertook that aerial baiting where we could, targeted trapping, and again we were able to sort of bring those that cat and fox activity down to within target levels and really sustain the fox activity to where we want it to be almost continuously. And again, 2023 release, why change a winning formula? So we've sort of undertaking that sort of strategic control again. I'm certainly not suggesting that we've cracked the code to the Goldilocks zone or anything like that. It's still really early stages for our project, but it's really important for us to monitor what's happening with foxes and cats, because the principle of our project is quite ambitious in the fact that we're just reducing fox and cat numbers to a manageable level, to a level that will allow for these vulnerable native species to persist. And what it is sort of showing is that, the bettongs are doing well. We are able to manage fox and cat numbers to a certain degree. So, all pretty positive. So look, what does that mean for Marna Banggara, the Yorke Peninsula in general? Are we seeing positive impacts in the environment? Short answer, too early to say. We're really only a couple of years in. But the long answer is that there is anecdotal evidence out there to suggest that we are seeing a reinvigoration of some of these ecological processes. If you go for a wander around Inniston and other areas where there's bettongs, you'll see lots of digging in the soil. So you've got these little micro habitats being created. They're actually eating the tubers of Cape tulip, which is an introduced weed. This really grainy video on the screen that you probably can't see much detail was sent in from one of our tourism operators on the Yorke Peninsula. And it's actually showing a heath goanna, which has predated a young feral cat and is dragging it back to its den. So it's just one of those little side notes that we've got native species there performing, those functions in the environment that they're supposed to. And early in the project, there was this really interesting study done by Kelly Meaney and led by David Peacock on barn owls and their role. And they were looking at sort of providing nest boxes for barn owls, and the moral of their research demonstrated that you provide nesting opportunities for barn owls, they will use them and they will use them successfully to breed. And they did a little diet study where they looked at what barn owls were bringing back to feed their young, and it was almost exclusively house mice. So, a really sort of positive indicator that, look, foxes and cats, maybe cats knock over a few, rodents around the farmhouse, but I'm pretty sure that foxes and cats aren't going to be used to control a mouse plague across the country. But these guys, barn owls, they can be a really important part of that ecosystem process. But it just sort of shows that, there's lots of opportunities, and I've seen in the today that there's going to be lots of interesting talks about the roles of different taxa in rewilding programs. There's huge opportunities for monitoring and research as part of our project going forward. And this just brings us to a little side note here. We were contacted by Tom Jamieson, a PhD candidate from Cambridge University, and he was really interested. He'd sort of seen Marna Banggara online, if you like, and he approached us. He was really interested at looking at the role that reptiles play in scavenging, and particularly in relation to rewilding projects. So he approached us, and we said, yeah, that would be fantastic. Come along, and we'll host you, and really interested in the work that he was looking at. And so his project involved these exposure experiments which to isolate different scavenging taxa in the environment. There were raised platforms that were supposed to be just for birds, and you can see in the photo on the screen there that goannas are pretty good at climbing, and we did have one goanna that got to the top of the platform. But yeah, there were ones to look at birds. There were caged baits out there, if you like. He was using rats actually, and so he was looking as well at the insects that were in the rats. And so he had caged off ones, and he had ones looking at insects. But yeah, really quite interesting. But what his work demonstrated was that in terms of scavenging, it was native birds were the most significant scavenger in the landscape. Goannas were also important. We've only got a really low population of goannas. It's probably a species that's really under threat on the mainland of South Australia, the heath goanna. But yeah, and less so, foxes and cats were less important in this sort of space. And the little flow-on effect that's, was a little unanticipated sort of highlight, I guess, of his study is he was actually also looking at blowfly larvae in the carcasses that he was leaving in the environment, and it showed that, yeah, birds and goannas were getting to these carcasses a lot quicker, and where they were the scavengers, there was a lot less blowfly larvae, and, that's an important one in an agricultural area to consider, that, heath goannas, native birds, they're really important. There might be potential flow-on effects to reducing fly strike. There was a fair bit of media attention in that one. I like the giant lizards could keep flesh-eating maggots off Australia's sheep. It's probably not a golden, it's probably not a silver bullet, I should say, but just an interesting little side note, and highlights the importance of sort of research and monitoring and just looking at what's happening across the environment. And in terms of extant species on the Yorks, we've got lots of really important species still there. We've lost most of those mammals, but we do have some really key birds like hooded plovers. It's an important spot for nesting hoodies. We've got malleefowl, and we've got these bushstone curlews as well. And I've just got a graph on there that just a really simple plot, just showing detections of bushstone curlews on our camera monitoring array. So we're not targeting looking for these guys, but they do pop up on the cameras every now and again. And this is a species that there's no records on the Yorke Peninsula, from the late 70s, early 80s through to the 2010s. And, even in the short time I've been involved with the project, we're sort of starting to see more regular sightings of these guys. And they're a really good indicator species because they're extremely vulnerable to fox predation. But we're similarly seeing that with sort of malleefowl. Anecdotal evidence suggests that heath goannas are doing really well. And we've also got a few echidnas popping up. Now, echidnas are a species that has persisted, but in super low numbers. So most people on the Yorks have never seen an echidna, particularly down the bottom end. We've got, tens of thousands of trap nights of data, and we've got 3 detections of echidnas. So I'm actually really interested to see what happens with echidnas as this project moves forward. I think they'll be a species that will respond really well going forward. And just look, in finishing, I want a big shout out to our team. We've got a good sized team. It's a fairly small team, I suppose, but we've got a predator control team. Cats and foxes. That's their game. We've got a project ecologist, and we've got a partnerships coordinator. So we're trying to cover all aspects of the project. Reduce the impact of predators, robust and informative monitoring programs, and also that engagement, First Nations community engagement. So the team are doing a great job of moving this project forward. And yeah, big shout out to our project stakeholders as well. It's an amazing project to be involved with, a real pleasure for me, and it's exciting to think of what the future can bring. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me along today, and
Yeah, I was just going to say, Derek, before you head off, we do have about 5 minutes, so we'd love to take some audience questions. Cameron has a microphone, so who wants to kick us off?
Yeah, that's okay, I'll talk loud.
Okay.
Derek, thanks. Have you considered the role of dingoes, what they could eventually play in keeping control of cat and fox numbers?
yeah, look, absolutely. Cut the video right now. No. Yeah, look, it's in an agricultural environment. You know, the D word is very controversial. Obviously, the role of top order predators is super important in the landscape. So we're considering, you know, what species are going to fulfil that role in that sort of top order predator environment. So we're sort of looking towards, you know, quolls, and at the end of the day, I'd love to think that long time into the future that dingoes may be able to play a role, but just at this point in time, in terms of dingoes, sheep farming, you know, it's trying to bring, I guess, those two groups, you know, the scientists, the literature, the evidence of the importance of dingoes in the environment, and also how that fits in a sheep farming landscape. I think there's probably a middle ground, but you know, we're a long way from that for our project. Yeah, that absolutely has been considered, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I come from a farming area, and I know the first thing they'd be saying is removable cats, and that would be so. What happened to the mice and the rats and the rabbits, and what happened to that population when you did remove?
Yeah, so it's important to note that we've still got cats and foxes in low numbers, and we've really focused our work at this point in time on the tip of the peninsula around the bettong reintroduction site. So we're sort of working our way upwards. We haven't noticed any change. So we do undertake some mouse monitoring surveys, and we have done some monitoring at sort of key times, you know, seeding, harvest, and there hasn't been any discernible sort of impacts at this point in time. We'll continue to keep an eye on it because, you know, you don't know what's going to happen. Although there has been plagues in other areas of Australia, there hasn't necessarily been sort of plague conditions on the Yorke Peninsula, sort of in the last few years. But it's something we're keeping an eye on, and obviously the barn owls is a consideration. If basically barn owl numbers in a natural environment will fluctuate with mouse numbers because that's their key prey. And so if there's nesting opportunities as mouse numbers rise, you know, barn owls will sort of fill that role, and I expect that animals like goannas, we've sort of considered, you know, phascogales and quolls and those sorts of species in the longer term of the project might fulfil that role. But I can't think of a time where, you know, outside of controlling rodents around, you know, your farmhouse, I can't think that, you know, foxes and cats have ever had a positive impact on mouse plagues in Australia. Yeah, but interesting one.
One over here.
Hi, thank you, Derek. You may have mentioned this, but roughly what's the portion of agricultural land to protected conservation space?
Yeah, good question. It's probably about 50-50. There's probably about 30% of land is really high quality remnant vegetation, and that's protected. Most of that's protected either in the Crown Reserve System or under heritage agreements on private property. And then you've got probably another, 10 to 15% that might just be small land holdings, hobby blocks and those sorts of things, or other enterprises. And then about 50% of it is, prime agricultural land, really. Yeah.
Derek, I was just interested in your thoughts on this observation. I had about 30 baited and non-baited cameras up in the Bendigo region for phascogales over
2 years, and in that time, many foxes caught on camera, but no cats. So I was just wondering what you thought of that observation.
Yeah, interesting. I know that there is evidence that, and they certainly, I think, saw this in WA, as part of that sort of that woylie sort of work that they were doing, that foxes, I think, in the landscape, may play a role in suppressing cat numbers, but what can also happen as well, and what I've seen in other areas where I've worked, is where you have a more dominant predator, whether it's a fox or whether it's the dingo, you might still have cats in the landscape, but the cats are being sort of pushed back to that maybe, less than optimal sort of habitat. So they might just sort of be persisting in the landscape, and I'd imagine they would be. But the foxes are probably as the prime predator are probably using the optimal habitat. It might just be the most detectable species. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I think you'll certainly get cohabitation of foxes and cats, but maybe foxes are suppressing them, or they might just be pushing them back into that suboptimal.
It's just a question around broader initiatives too. Is there any cat curfews and stuff and other integrated pest management actions outside the project that are helping you?
Yeah, so the Yorke Peninsula Council, which covers the whole of the Yorks, they've got a sort of a proactive approach, I guess, to local bylaws. At this point in time, there is no curfews, but that is something that we would hope to work with YPC over time to look at ways of, managing, domestic cats and reducing their impact. But at this point in time, microchip, sterilise, register is the minimum requirements for landholders. But I hope that one day, we can. There are a few local government areas that are getting on board in South Australia, and I don't know what's happening around here, but not yet on the Yorks, but we're hoping that, maybe one day.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, from a biocultural perspective, what do the Aboriginal community, what do they see as the important species and animals that should be back on country, and are you working with them as you make your decisions about what animals to focus on?
That is an awesome question, and we're actually in the process at the moment. What's fantastic for the project is we've just confirmed some funding from the Commonwealth Government for the next 4 years, which will keep things ticking along. So given the success thus far of the Yorke reintroductions, we're just reviewing our sort of species prioritisation, if you like. So initially it probably was more on that sort of that ecological function focus as being the most important aspects, but we're, taking it back to the drawing table, and we're actually running a series of workshops over the next couple of months with some key members of Narungga community to actually look at some of those culturally significant species. So species like the brush-tailed possum, which does persist on the Yorke Peninsula, but mostly just around the towns. Is a really significant species, but there might be others as well. We're trying to, as I sort of mentioned before, we don't want to be a project that is running and communicating or with the Narungga community. We want the Narungga community to be involved and actually on ground, doing work and helping advise things going forward. So something we're working on, but it's really interesting. Yeah.